She invited her poor twin sister to mock her at her wedding, as she walked in with her billionaire husband. But Addison knew. Addison knew exactly who this woman was and what her presence meant. Every lie she told about her family background, every time she claimed to be an only child, every moment she pretended her sister didn't exist, all of it was about to crumble under the weight of this single, devastating entrance. Have you ever walked into a room and felt every eye judging you? Hi viewers, comment tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The gasps that filled Atlanta's most exclusive ballroom weren't for the bride. They were for the woman everyone thought would never amount to anything, walking in on the arm of a billionaire. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing light across silk gowns and diamond jewelry. But every eye in the room had abandoned the bride at the altar to stare at the entrance. The woman they dismissed walked like she owned not just the room, but the entire city. Addison Marshall Whitmore stood frozen at the altar, her perfect smile cracking like expensive makeup in summer heat. She had planned this moment for months. Every detail calculated, every guest list entry strategic. The Golden Ballroom of Atlanta's premier wedding venue gleamed with old money and new pretensions, exactly the backdrop she needed to cement her place in Georgia's social elite. But none of that mattered now, because her twin sister, the one she'd invited only to humiliate, had just walked through those oak doors wearing a dress that cost more than most people's cars. And the man beside her? Every person in that room knew his face from Forbes magazine covers. Ethan Marshall, billionaire investor from New York. The kind of man whose handshake could make or break entire companies. Addison had whispered to her bridesmaids earlier, her voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. Wait until you see her. She'll remind everyone why I'm the better twin. She'd expected Lila to show up in a thrift store dress, with hands still rough from whatever menial job she was working. Expected to watch her sister shrink under the judgmental stares of Atlanta's finest. Instead, Lila glided across marble floors like she'd been born to wealth. Her midnight blue gown hugged curves that spoke of personal trainers and nutritionists. Diamonds caught the light at her throat and wrists. Not costume jewelry, but stones that could fund college educations. The orchestra faltered mid-note. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the photographer lowered his camera, too stunned to capture the moment that was rewriting everything everyone thought they knew. Ethan's hand rested possessively on Lila's lower back, his fingers tracing small patterns through the designer silk. She leaned into his touch with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly how desired she was. The electricity between them was visible, magnetic. Other guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware they were witnessing something intimate and powerful. Addison's groom, wealthy by Atlanta standards, but a pauper compared to the man now dominating every conversation without saying a word, looked like he might be sick. David Whitmore had thought marrying Addison would secure his place among Georgia's power players. Now he was staring at real power, the kind that made his family's textile fortune look like pocket change. Have you ever walked into a room and felt every eye judging you? Do you know what it's like when family treats you like you're not good enough? This is about more than jealousy. It's about years of being invisible. Watch how one entrance can rewrite an entire family story. Lila's transformation was impossible to ignore. Gone was the girl who'd once worked double shifts to help pay for Addison's college applications. Gone was the daughter who'd stayed home to care for their sick mother while Addison climbed social ladders. In her place stood a woman who commanded attention without demanding it, who wore wealth like she'd been born to it, but hadn't forgotten where she came from. The guests began to whisper, their voices creating a buzz that filled the golden space like swarming bees. Who was this woman? How had she captured Ethan Marshall's attention? Where had she been hiding such sophistication? But Addison knew. Addison knew exactly who this woman was and what her presence meant. Every lie she'd told about her family background, every time she claimed to be an only child, every moment she'd pretended her sister didn't exist, all of it was about to crumble under the weight of this single, devastating entrance. The irony cut deep. Addison had invited Lila specifically to showcase the difference between them. to let Atlanta's elite see exactly why she deserved her place among them, while her twin remained stuck in whatever small life she'd built. The invitation had been an act of calculated cruelty, designed to highlight everything Lila lacked. Instead, it became the moment Addison lost everything she'd worked to build. Because Ethan Marshall wasn't just wealthy, he was connected. His business dealings stretched across industries. His influence reached into boardrooms where decisions were made about people like David Whitmore. His presence at this wedding wasn't just social. It was a statement. And that statement was written in the way he looked at Lila, like she was the most precious thing in any room they entered together. The photographer finally raised his camera again, but he wasn't shooting the bride anymore. He was capturing the couple who'd just stolen every headline this wedding might have generated. Tomorrow's society pages wouldn't feature Addison's carefully planned perfection. They'd showcase the mystery woman who'd appeared from nowhere with one of America's most powerful men. As Ethan whispered something in Lila's ear that made her smile. A real smile, not the practiced expression Addison had perfected. Every person in that ballroom realized they were witnessing history. Not the joining of two suitable families, but the emergence of a love story that would redefine everything they thought they knew about worthiness and value. As Ethan whispered something in Lila's ear that made her smile, Addison's groom turned pale. He recognized Ethan's face from business magazines and suddenly realized his own worth had just been measured and found wanting. 28 years ago, two identical faces entered the world 3 minutes apart, but from that moment, their mother treated them like they were from different planets. The trailer park where they grew up wasn't the kind of poverty that looked noble in movies. It was the kind that made children ashamed to invite friends over, where dinner sometimes meant cereal and hope. Birmingham, Alabama, stretched beyond their small world like a promise neither twin dare believe in. Their mother, Sandra, worked 3 jobs just to keep the electricity on and food in their small refrigerator. She cleaned offices at dawn, stocked shelves at the grocery store in the afternoons, and served drinks at the local bar until closing time. But even exhausted and stretched thin, Sandra saw something different in her daughters from the very beginning. Addison cried louder, demanded more attention, fought harder for every scrap of affection. She learned early that tears could get her what she wanted, that a well-timed tantrum could redirect their mother's focus from bills to comfort. By age 5, she'd mastered the art of making herself the priority. Lila, born 3 minutes later, but somehow carrying the weight of being second her entire life, learned different lessons. She learned that love meant taking care of others. That worth came from usefulness. That the way to earn affection was to never ask for it. When Sandra came home bone-tired from her triple shifts, it was Lila who had dinner waiting, even if that dinner was just peanut butter sandwiches and whatever fruit hadn't gone bad. It was Lila who helped with homework, who remembered parent-teacher conference dates, who made sure their school clothes were clean even when the washing machine broke down for months. Addison spent those same years practicing different voices in the mirror, trying to sound less Southern, less poor, less like the life she was determined to escape. She studied the girls at school whose mothers drove nice cars, whose clothes came from malls instead of thrift stores, whose lunch money never ran out midweek. The night that changed everything happened when they were 16. Sandra had been feeling sick for weeks, but couldn't afford to miss work or see a doctor. She collapsed in the bathroom, blood staining her work uniform, fear written across her face as she realized how long she'd been ignoring symptoms she couldn't afford to investigate. Lila found her first, called 911, held her mother's hand in the ambulance while Addison stayed home, claiming she had a test the next day she couldn't miss. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at the hospital when the doctors explained Sandra needed surgery they couldn't afford. When medical bills started arriving like threats, each envelope containing numbers that might as well have been written in foreign languages for all the sense they made to teenage girls from a trailer park. Lila dropped out of advanced classes to work more hours at the grocery store, where she'd started bagging groceries after school. She gave up plans for college applications, gave up dreams of anything beyond surviving the next month's expenses. Every dollar she earned went toward medical bills and keeping their small household running. Addison made different choices. She applied for every scholarship she could find, spending hours in the school library crafting essays about overcoming adversity while her sister actually lived it. She studied harder, not just for grades but for escape routes. Every academic achievement was a step away from the life that felt like quicksand, pulling her down toward a future she refused to accept. Have you ever been the child who stayed home while your sibling got a shine? Tell me in the comments what that felt like. Their mother recovered, but slowly. The medical debt never did. It followed them like a shadow, making every expense a calculation, every purchase a sacrifice. Sandra looked at her daughters differently after that crisis. She saw Addison's determination to rise above their circumstances and called it strength. She saw Lila's willingness to sacrifice for family and called it duty. The scholarships came through. Full ride to University of Georgia, based on Addison's perfect grades and compelling personal essays about growing up poor and determined. Essays Lila had helped research and edit, staying up late to proofread applications while working double shifts to keep their household afloat. The night before Addison left for college, she sat on the edge of her twins' bed in their shared room, the same room where they'd whispered secrets and shared dreams since childhood. But instead of gratitude or promises to stay in touch, Addison's words cut like surgical tools, precise and devastating. "I'm going to make something of myself," she said, folding clothes that were nicer than anything Lila owned. "I'm going to be somebody important, and that means I can't be tied down by all this." She gestured around their small room with disgust. By the kind of life that keeps people stuck forever. Lila sat quietly, understanding what her sister wasn't quite brave enough to say directly. That all this included her. That becoming somebody important meant leaving behind everyone who'd helped make that transformation possible. The night Addison left for college on a full scholarship, one that Lila had helped her earn by working weekends to pay for SAT prep, she made a promise that would haunt them both. "Don't follow me. I won't be your sister where I'm going." Addison didn't just marry into Atlanta society. She erased every trace of where she came from, including the sister who sacrificed everything for her success. The country club where she now hosted charity luncheons gleamed with old money and new pretensions. Every surface polished to reflect success while hiding the cracks underneath. College transformed Addison in ways that went far beyond education. At the University of Georgia, she studied more than business and communications. She studied the women around her who'd been born into the life she desperately wanted. She watched how they moved, how they spoke, how they never seemed to worry about money or acceptance because both had always been guaranteed. She learned to flatten her accent until no trace of Alabama remained. Learned to talk about spring breaks in places she'd never been and family traditions she'd never had. When classmates asked about her background, she crafted stories about her family's financial setbacks that required her to work harder than most students, painting herself as temporarily disadvantaged rather than genuinely poor. The lies came easier than breathing. By sophomore year, she'd caught the attention of David Whitmore, whose family owned textile mills across the South and whose trust fund meant he'd never worked a day in his life for anything that mattered. He was handsome in the soft way of men who'd never faced real hardship, with perfect teeth and the kind of confidence that came from generations of assumed superiority. David liked that Addison seemed authentic compared to other women he'd dated, women who'd grown up with the same privileges he had and therefore bored him. He found her hunger refreshing, her determination attractive, her carefully constructed backstory just tragic enough to make him feel noble for choosing her. She played the role perfectly, grateful but not desperate, impressed by his world but not overwhelmed, smart enough to contribute to conversations but never so smart as to make him feel inadequate. She became exactly what he wanted, a beautiful woman who made him feel generous and important while asking nothing uncomfortable of him in return. The engagement ring came during their senior year, presented at a restaurant expensive enough to impress her and familiar enough to comfort him. She said yes with tears in her eyes, real tears, because she understood she was finally, permanently escaping the life that had tried to claim her. But the wedding planning revealed how completely she'd transformed. When David's mother asked about her family's participation in the ceremony, Addison's answer came without hesitation. Her parents were dead, she had no siblings, and she preferred to focus on building their new life together rather than dwelling on losses she'd rather not discuss. The lie felt like freedom. Have you ever known someone who changed so completely you couldn't recognize them anymore? What would you do if family denied your existence? Their wedding was everything she dreamed of and everything their trailer park childhood had taught her to want. Flowers that cost more than her mother made in a month. A dress that required 3 fittings and cost more than their family's annual income. Guests who represented every level of Atlanta society she'd fought to join. She wore white with perfect confidence, not because of any moral significance, but because she'd successfully erased the girl who'd once shared a bedroom with hand-me-down sheets and dreams too small for her growing ambitions. The honeymoon in Europe cemented her new identity. She photographed herself against backgrounds that screamed wealth and sophistication, sending images to social media accounts that told a carefully curated story of a woman who'd always belonged in such places. No mention of Birmingham. No reference to the family she'd left behind. No acknowledgement of a sister who'd worked double shifts, so she could focus on studies that led to this exact moment. Married life in Atlanta fulfilled every fantasy she'd constructed during those years of escape. The house David bought for them sat in the most exclusive neighborhood, with columns and gardens that proved to every visitor exactly how far she'd climbed. Charity work gave her purpose and visibility. The kind of causes that looked good in newspaper coverage and made her feel important while helping people she'd never have to actually know. She became known for hosting events that raised money for worthy causes, always careful to choose organizations that serve populations far enough away to avoid uncomfortable reminders of her own past. Education initiatives for underprivileged youth allowed her to feel generous while maintaining safe distance from the kinds of children she'd once been. The ultimate test came during a Society reporter's interview for a feature about rising young philanthropists in Atlanta. When asked about her background and what inspired her charitable work, Addison delivered her practiced response without hesitation. I'm an only child from a family that valued education and service. My parents passed away when I was young, but they taught me that with privilege comes responsibility. Every word was calculated. Every detail designed to create sympathy without raising questions. She becomes so skilled at rewriting history that she almost believed her own stories. But late at night, in the silence of her perfect house with her sleeping husband beside her, sometimes memories crept through her carefully constructed walls. Images of Lila helping her with homework, of her sister working extra hours so they could afford application fees, of the quiet sacrifices that had made her transformation possible. When the Society reporter asked about her family background for the wedding announcement, Addison's answer was swift and cold. I'm an only child. She had no idea her lie would soon be exposed in the most public way possible. While Addison was learning to hold champagne flutes, Lila was holding their mother's hand through chemotherapy, alone. The hospital corridors became her second home, antiseptic white walls, and beeping machines the soundtrack to her 20s, while other women her age were falling in love and building careers. After Addison left for college, their small trailer felt even smaller. Her sister's empty bed served as a daily reminder of dreams that felt impossible for the daughter who'd stayed behind. But Lila didn't have time for self-pity. Their mother's health was declining, and medical bills arrived with relentless regularity, each envelope containing numbers that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Sandra's condition required regular treatments and medications that insurance barely covered. The copays alone stretched their budget beyond breaking, and the experimental treatment her doctors recommended might as well have been priced on the moon for all the accessibility they offered a family living paycheck to paycheck. Lila took on additional hours at the grocery store, working early morning stock shifts before her regular afternoon schedule. She cleaned houses on weekends, took whatever odd jobs came her way through community bulletin boards and word of mouth. Every dollar earned went directly to medical expenses or basic household needs, leaving nothing for dreams or plans beyond surviving the next month. The loneliness cut deeper than the financial stress. She watched former classmates post college photos on social media, celebrating sororities and spring breaks and opportunities that felt like glimpses into alternate universes. Meanwhile, her own life had shrunk to work, hospital visits, and the kind of exhaustion that made even simple pleasures feel impossible. During Sandra's worst days, when treatments left her too weak to get out of bed or keep food down, Lila became everything. Caregiver, breadwinner, cheerleader, and the only witness to her mother's courage in facing an illness they couldn't afford to fight properly. She learned to give injections, manage medication schedules, and recognize the signs that meant emergency room visits they definitely couldn't afford. But Sandra was stronger than her circumstances. She fought every treatment with determination that inspired everyone around her, from the hospital staff to other patients who drew strength from her positive attitude despite obvious financial stress. She talked constantly about both her daughters, proud of Addison's success in school and grateful for Lila's sacrifices at home. What would you sacrifice for family? When does loyalty become self-destruction? Share your thoughts below. The isolation grew heavier as months passed into years. Lila's world had contracted to work and caregiving, leaving no space for the relationships or experiences that typically define young adulthood. She dated occasionally, but found it difficult to explain her circumstances without sounding like she was asking for pity or rescue. Most men her age weren't equipped to understand the weight of responsibility she carried, and she wasn't willing to burden potential relationships with the reality of her situation. She developed a different kind of strength during those years, the quiet resilience that comes from carrying burdens without complaint, from finding reasons to smile even when circumstances offered little hope. Hospital staff knew her by name, not just because of frequent visits, but because of how she treated everyone with genuine kindness despite her own stress. Her rare moments of self-care came in stolen minutes, catching her reflection in hospital bathroom mirrors and being surprised by glimpses of beauty that had developed almost without her noticing. Working physical jobs had given her a lean strength that expensive gym memberships couldn't buy. Constant stress had sharpened her features into something striking, though she rarely had time or energy to appreciate her own transformation. The guilt came in waves. Guilt about wanting more than survival. Guilt about envying her sister's escape. Guilt about feeling resentful toward their mother's illness, even though she knew such feelings were unfair. Guilt about wondering what her own life might have looked like if she'd been the one to leave for college instead of the one who stayed to hold everything together. Sandra never stopped talking about Addison's success, sharing updates from phone calls that came less frequently as college years progressed. Graduation announcements arrived with photos that showed how completely her sister had transformed, polished, confident, surrounded by people who looked like they'd never worried about medical bills or whether the electricity would stay on. The wedding invitation came like a slap delivered through postal service. Expensive paper, formal wording, an address in Atlanta that might as well have been on another planet. Sandra cried when she opened it, tears mixing joy for one daughter's success with sadness that their financial situation made attending impossible. "She wants us there," Sandra insisted, though Lila could read between the lines of the formal invitation language. This wasn't a request for family support. It was a social obligation being fulfilled with minimal enthusiasm. But they couldn't afford travel expenses, appropriate clothing, or wedding gifts that wouldn't embarrass them among Atlanta society. More importantly, Lila couldn't risk leaving her mother for the extended time such a trip would require. Sandra's health remained precarious, requiring daily attention that made even short absences potentially dangerous. The night their mother died, Lila called Addison's number, the same one she'd had for years but never used. It went straight to voicemail. This number is no longer in service. Even in death, she would face loss alone. She was serving appetizers at a Manhattan charity gala when the most powerful man in the room looked at her like she was the only person worth seeing. The penthouse ballroom overlooked Central Park, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city lights like expensive art, but he couldn't take his eyes off the woman refilling champagne glasses with quiet grace. After their mother's funeral, a small service Lila paid for with money she didn't have, attended by neighbors who'd known Sandra as the woman who worked 3 jobs but never complained. The emptiness felt suffocating. The trailer that had housed 3 people, then 2, now echoed with silence that made grief feel even heavier. But staying in Birmingham meant drowning in memories and medical debt that would follow her forever. The life insurance policy Sandra had maintained barely covered funeral expenses, leaving Lila with nothing but inherited obligations and a growing understanding that surviving in their hometown would mean accepting a future as limited as her past. So she took what little money remained, sold everything that had any value, and bought a bus ticket to New Jersey. Not because she had connections or opportunities waiting, but because it was far enough away to feel like starting over and close enough to New York City that maybe, somehow, she could build something better. The apartment she found was barely larger than their old trailer, but it was hers. Shared with 2 roommates who worked restaurant jobs and kept different schedules, it offered something she'd never experienced before: independence. No one to take care of except herself. No medical appointments to coordinate or bills to juggle beyond her own basic survival. Her first job was cleaning office buildings at night, work that paid cash and asked no questions about experience or references. She learned the city through empty corporate corridors and conference rooms that smelled like success she couldn't imagine achieving. By day, she slept in her small room or looked for additional work that might offer better pay or more promising prospects. The catering company hired her because she was willing to work weekends and holidays, because she showed up reliably, and because she had the kind of natural elegance that made wealthy clients feel comfortable having her serve their guests. The work was physically demanding, but offered glimpses into lives that fascinated her. Charity galas, corporate celebrations, private parties where single bottles of wine cost more than she made in a week. She learned to move invisibly through rooms full of important people, to anticipate needs without being asked, to smile pleasantly while remaining essentially invisible. The uniform helped: black dress, simple jewelry, hair pulled back in a style that looked professional without calling attention to itself. But she also learned to observe, to notice how truly confident people carried themselves differently from those who were performing confidence. To recognize the difference between wealth that came from accomplishment and wealth that came from inheritance. To understand that real power often spoke quietly, while insecurity had to announce itself constantly. The Manhattan Charity Gala was her biggest assignment yet, a fundraiser for children's medical research hosted in a penthouse ballroom that cost more to rent for one evening than most people made in a year. The guest list included politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and the kinds of people whose names appeared in newspapers for donating amounts that could change lives. She'd been working events long enough to recognize faces from magazine covers and social media. But Ethan Marshall was different. Not because of his wealth, though his net worth was discussed in financial circles like a force of nature, but because of how he moved through the crowd. Confident without being aggressive. Attentive without seeming calculating. Present in conversations without appearing to work the room. And he noticed her in a way that made her skin warm despite the professional distance she maintained with all clients. Have you ever felt instant chemistry with someone completely out of your league? That moment when someone sees past your circumstances to who you really are? It started with small interactions. His glass was never empty when she passed his section of the room, but he never demanded attention or treated her like hired help. He said, "Thank you," in a way that made eye contact and seemed to actually see her as a person rather than a function. When she offered appetizers, he asked quiet questions about the food that felt like genuine interest rather than polite conversation. The electrical moment came during a lull in the evening when most servers were refilling champagne glasses and clearing plates. She was adjusting flower arrangements on a side table when she sensed someone watching her. When she looked up, Ethan was standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, Something expensive but not overwhelming, subtle like everything else about his confidence. "You have excellent instincts," he said quietly, nodding toward the flowers she'd been arranging. "Those looked beautiful before, but they're perfect now." The compliment caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it felt genuine. She'd spent years being praised by employers for her work ethic or reliability, but no one had ever noticed her aesthetic choices or suggested she might have talents beyond basic functionality. "Thank you," she managed, suddenly aware that her heart was beating faster than professional interactions typically warranted. Their conversation was brief, interrupted by other guests requiring his attention, but something shifted in that exchange. She found herself more aware of where he was in the room, more conscious of her own movements when she was near his section. Not because she was trying to impress him, but because his earlier attention had awakened something she'd forgotten existed. Curiosity about herself as someone worthy of notice. When the event ended and she was collecting empty glasses, she found a business card tucked under one plate with a handwritten note. "Coffee? Not because I pity you, but because I can't stop thinking about you." She almost didn't show up to that coffee date until she realized she had nothing left to lose and everything to discover about herself. The small cafe in Brooklyn felt like a world away from Manhattan's glittering towers, worn wooden tables and mismatched chairs, where honesty was the only currency that mattered. Lila stared at the business card for 3 days, turning it over in her hands like it might reveal some hidden meaning beyond the simple invitation written across expensive paper. Ethan Marshall. She'd looked him up online, of course, spending hours reading articles about his business empire, his charitable foundations, his reputation for turning struggling companies into success stories. Everything she read made the invitation seem more impossible. Men like him didn't drink coffee with women like her. They didn't notice catering staff beyond ensuring their glasses stayed full. They certainly didn't leave handwritten notes that suggested genuine interest rather than casual entertainment. But loneliness had a way of making impossible things seem worth risking. The cafe he'd suggested sat in a quiet corner of Brooklyn, far from the financial district where his office commanded entire floors of gleaming skyscrapers. She arrived 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly because punctuality had been drilled into her by years of service jobs where being late meant being replaced. When he walked through the door, she almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the perfectly tailored suit and corporate confidence. Instead, he wore jeans and a simple button-down shirt, looking younger and more approachable than the man she'd served champagne to just days earlier. He spotted her immediately, his face lighting up with a smile that seemed genuinely happy rather than politely pleased. As he approached her corner table, she noticed other women in the cafe watching him with obvious interest, but his attention remained focused entirely on her. "You came," he said, settling into the chair across from her with relief in his voice. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure either," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Their conversation started carefully, both testing boundaries and expectations. But something about the casual setting and his unexpected vulnerability made her usual walls feel less necessary. When he asked about her life, she found herself telling him real stories instead of the sanitized versions she typically offered to employers or casual acquaintances. She told him about her mother's illness, about the years of hospital visits and medical bills that had shaped every decision she'd made since high school. About leaving Birmingham, not because she had opportunities waiting, but because staying felt like drowning. About working multiple jobs in New Jersey while trying to build something that felt like a real life rather than just survival. When was the last time someone was genuinely interested in your story? How did it feel to be truly heard? What surprised her most was how he listened. Not with the polite attention people usually offered before redirecting conversations to themselves, but with the kind of focus that made her feel like her experiences mattered. He asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually absorbing what she said, making connections between different parts of her story that revealed an intelligence she hadn't expected. "You sacrificed your 20s to take care of someone you loved," he said quietly, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength most people never develop because they're never tested. The observation caught her off guard, not because it was wrong, but because no one had ever framed her choices that way. She'd spent years feeling like she'd missed out on normal experiences, like she'd somehow failed by not pursuing education or career opportunities the way other people her age had done. But in his eyes, she saw something different. Respect, admiration, interest that went beyond physical attraction to encompass the person her experiences had shaped her into becoming. He talked about his own life with surprising openness, describing the loneliness that came with wealth and success, how business relationships were always transactional, how social connections felt calculated, how difficult it was to trust people's motivations when you never knew if they wanted you or what you could provide them. "I've been surrounded by people my entire adult life," he said, leaning forward with intensity that made her pulse quicken, "but I haven't felt truly seen by anyone in years. Until 3 nights ago, when you looked at me like I was just a person instead of a portfolio." The admission created intimacy that felt dangerous and thrilling at the same time. Their knees brushed under the small table, and neither moved away. When he reached across to touch her hand while making a point, electricity shot through her fingers and straight to places that had been dormant for longer than she cared to remember. The coffee grew cold as hours passed without either of them noticing. Outside, Brooklyn moved through its evening rhythm, while inside their corner of the cafe, the world had contracted to just the two of them and conversations that felt like discovery. When he walked her to the subway station, the energy between them had shifted into something charged with possibility. They moved closer together as they walked, shoulders brushing, hands occasionally touching as they gestured while talking. As they walked to the subway, he stopped suddenly. "I want to see you again. Not for charity, not out of pity, because you're the most real person I've met in years." She looked up at his face and saw something that terrified her. Hope. The first time he took her to his penthouse, she understood the difference between having money and wielding power, and why he chose to share both with her. His penthouse stretched across the top floor of the building, art worth millions casually displayed on walls. But the most beautiful sight was her silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows as she watched the city spread below. Their second date happened 5 days later, though Ethan had wanted to call her the next morning. Something about her combination of strength and vulnerability had gotten under his skin in ways he hadn't expected. She was different from the women he typically encountered, women who knew exactly what he was worth before they knew his last name, who calculated interest based on net worth rather than genuine connection. Lila had looked him up after their coffee date, of course. The internet provided plenty of information about his business empire, his charitable work, his reputation for turning around failing companies through strategic investment and operational improvements. But reading about wealth was different from experiencing it firsthand. The building where he lived required security clearance just to reach his floor. The elevator opened directly into his apartment, eliminating even the pretense of hallways or neighbors. When she stepped into his living space, the sheer scale took her breath away. Everything was beautiful and expensive, but not in the showy way she'd expected. Instead, his taste ran toward understated elegance. Furniture that looked comfortable despite obviously costing more than most people's cars. Artwork that drew the eye without demanding attention. Technology integrated so seamlessly it became invisible. But what struck her most was how he moved through the space. This wasn't a showplace designed to impress visitors. This was home to someone who'd created exactly the environment he wanted, without compromise or concern for anyone else's opinions. "It's incredible," she said, moving toward the windows that offered panoramic views of Manhattan, stretching in every direction. "It's lonely," he replied quietly, joining her at the glass wall that separated them from a drop that would terrify most people. Beautiful, comfortable, secure, but lonely. The honesty in his voice made her turn to look at him instead of the view. He was watching her face, studying her reaction to his world with an intensity that suggested her opinion mattered more than he wanted to admit. Have you ever felt guilty for wanting something beautiful? What would you do if someone wanted to give you everything you'd never dare to dream of? When he offered to cook dinner instead of ordering from restaurants that would deliver anything they wanted within minutes, she realized how deliberately he was trying to create intimacy rather than simply showcase his lifestyle. They worked together in his kitchen, a space designed for serious cooking despite the fact that he rarely had time to use it properly. She found herself relaxing in ways that surprised her. The nervousness she'd felt about his wealth began to fade as she watched him struggle with basic tasks like chopping vegetables and timing different dishes to finish simultaneously. His competence in boardrooms didn't translate to domestic skills, and his willingness to look incompetent in front of her felt like a gift. "You don't have to impress me," she said, taking over the sauce that was about to burn while he focused on not overcooking the pasta. "Good," he replied, moving to stand behind her at the stove, his chest against her back as he reached around to hand her a wooden spoon. "Because I'm failing spectacularly at that anyway." The casual contact sent heat racing through her body in ways that had nothing to do with the stove. She'd been attracted to him from their first meeting, but physical desire had taken a back seat to the impossibility of their different circumstances. Now, in the intimacy of his private space, what became harder to ignore. After dinner, they moved to his couch, Italian leather that probably cost more than she made in 6 months, with wine that tasted like liquid sophistication. The conversation flowed as easily as it had in the Brooklyn Cafe, but the setting added layers of possibility that changed everything. When he leaned closer to make a point about something, she found herself studying his mouth instead of listening to his words. When she tucked her legs under herself on the couch, the movement brought them closer together, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the heat radiating from his body. "Lila," he said quietly, and something in his voice made her look up to find him watching her with undisguised want. "I need you to know that I'm not trying to rescue you or fix you or turn you into some kind of project. You're not broken, and you don't need saving." The words were exactly what she hadn't known she needed to hear. Every relationship she'd attempted since her mother's death had felt shadowed by her circumstances, by men who seemed to want to either save her from her life or use her struggles as proof of their own generosity. "What do you want then?" she asked, surprised by the boldness in her own voice. "You," he said simply. "Just you. The woman who worked 3 jobs to take care of someone she loved. The woman who started over in a new city with nothing but determination. The woman who looks at me like I'm just a person instead of a bank account." First passionate kiss against the window overlooking Manhattan, his hands in her hair, her surprise at her own desire, and his reverent response to every sound she made. As they lay together on his Italian leather couch, her head on his chest, he murmured words that changed everything. "I want to introduce you to my world, not as my guest, but as my equal." She had no idea how literally he meant it. The day she said yes to his world was the day she began to understand that confidence isn't something you buy, it's something you choose to claim. The boutiques of Fifth Avenue became her classroom, designer fitting rooms her laboratory for discovering who she could become when someone believed in her potential. Ethan's approach to her transformation surprised her. Instead of trying to remake her into some version of the women who typically moved through his social circles, he seemed determined to enhance what was already there. When he suggested shopping for clothes that would work in more upscale environments, he brought along a personal stylist who listened more than she talked. "We're not changing you," the stylist explained during their first session at Bergdorf Goodman. "We're giving you tools to feel comfortable anywhere you want to go." The difference mattered. Instead of feeling like she was playing dress-up in someone else's costume, the clothes they selected felt like armor designed specifically for her body and personality. Classic pieces that would work in boardrooms or charity galas, but with details that reflected her own taste rather than generic sophistication. But the real transformation went deeper than wardrobe changes. Ethan arranged for her to audit business classes at Columbia, not because he wanted to remake her professionally, but because he noticed how quickly she absorbed information and how naturally she understood complex problems. "You have instinct about people and situations that can't be taught," he told her after she'd analyzed a business case study with insights that impressed even him. "You just need vocabulary to express what you already understand." The classes challenged her in ways she hadn't experienced since high school. Her mind, sharpened by years of solving practical problems under pressure, adapted quickly to academic concepts and theoretical frameworks. For the first time since her mother's illness had derailed her educational plans, she remembered how much she enjoyed learning. What would you become if someone invested in your potential? Have you ever discovered parts of yourself you didn't know existed? The social aspects of her new life proved more complicated than the intellectual ones. Ethan's world included gallery openings, charity fundraisers, business dinners where conversations moved seamlessly between topics she was still learning about. But instead of throwing her into situations where she'd feel lost, he prepared her. Before every event, they'd spend time reviewing guest lists and talking through likely conversation topics. Not so she could pretend to know things she didn't, but so she could participate authentically without feeling completely out of her depth. You don't need to impress anyone, he reminded her before her first corporate dinner. These people spend their lives trying to impress each other. Someone who listens well and asks thoughtful questions will stand out more than someone trying to prove how much they know. He was right. Her natural curiosity and genuine interest in other people's experiences made her popular at events where most attendees seemed more interested in being heard than in hearing others. Business leaders found themselves telling her stories about their company's origins or challenges they were facing, drawn by her ability to ask follow-up questions that showed she was really paying attention. The physical transformation happened more gradually, so subtly she barely noticed it herself until she caught her reflection in the mirror of an expensive restaurant's bathroom and didn't immediately recognize the woman looking back at her. Regular meals that weren't eaten standing up in restaurant kitchens had filled out her too thin frame in healthy ways. A gym membership and personal trainer had built on the lean strength she developed through years of physical work, adding definition and confidence to her posture. Professional hair and skincare treatments enhanced features that had always been striking but were now showcased instead of hidden. But the biggest change was internal. For the first time in her adult life, she had space to think about what she wanted instead of just responding to immediate needs and crises. The mental energy she'd spent on survival could now focus on growth, exploration, discovery of interests and talents that had been dormant for years. 3 months into her transformation, she realized she was falling in love, not just with Ethan, but with the version of herself that emerged when someone believed in her potential without trying to control or reshape her essential character. Their physical relationship had developed with the same careful attention he brought to every other aspect of their connection. Private fashion shows in his bedroom became opportunities for intimacy that went beyond the sexual, though the attraction between them grew stronger every day. The way he looked at her when she tried on expensive clothes, the pride in his eyes when she mastered new concepts in her business classes, the protective way he touched her lower back when they entered rooms full of people who might judge her, all of it made her feel desired and valued in ways she'd never experienced. But it was during a quiet evening in his apartment, when she was wearing one of his shirts and reading a book for her economics class while he worked on his laptop nearby, that she understood how completely her life had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something. 3 months into her transformation, Ethan received an invitation that made him smile with wicked satisfaction. Addison Marshall Whitmore's wedding in Atlanta. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," he told Lila, showing her the invitation. Her blood ran cold when she saw her sister's name. Revenge is a dish best served with a billionaire boyfriend and a designer dress that costs more than your sister's mortgage. The war room wasn't a boardroom. It was his bedroom, where strategies were planned between kisses and justice was plotted against silk sheets. Lila stared at the wedding invitation until the elegant script blurred through tears she refused to let fall. Addison Marshall Whitmore. Even seeing her sister's married name felt like a punch to the chest, a reminder of all the ways their lives had diverged since that night in Birmingham when Addison had walked away from everything they'd shared. "How do you know my sister?" she asked Ethan, her voice carefully controlled despite the chaos in her chest. His expression shifted as pieces clicked into place. Addison Whitmore is your sister? The one who... He didn't finish the sentence, but she could see him connecting dots between the stories she'd told him about family abandonment and the woman whose wedding invitation he'd received through business connections. She invited you? The absurdity of it hit her like cold water. Her sister, who had spent years pretending Lila didn't exist, had invited the man who'd become the center of her world to witness the celebration of everything Addison had built by erasing their shared past. Ethan's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. David Whitmore handles some investments for clients in my network. The invitation was business courtesy. I barely know either of them personally. His voice grew harder. She's the sister who abandoned you? Who wasn't there when your mother died? The anger in his tone surprised her. She'd told him about her family's dynamics, but hearing him speak about Addison with such obvious contempt made the betrayal feel fresh and raw again. She doesn't know about you, Lila said quietly. She has no idea I'm even in New York, let alone. She gestured between them, unable to find words for what they'd become to each other. Good. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. That gives us an advantage. Have you ever wanted to show someone who hurt you exactly what they lost? What's the difference between justice and revenge? Over the next hour, the full scope of their shared revelation unfolded. Ethan knew David Whitmore's financial situation through business channels, successful enough to maintain appearances, but nowhere near the wealth he pretended to command. The Whitmore family's textile business was struggling with overseas competition and changing markets, making David's marriage to Addison as much about social positioning as personal attraction. He's been trying to get meetings with me for months, Ethan explained, his strategic mind already working through possibilities. Wants investment backing for expansion projects that won't survive basic financial analysis. The wedding invitation was probably his way of trying to create a social connection he could leverage later. Lila found herself caught between conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted nothing to do with her sister's wedding or the reminder of everything Addison had rejected in pursuit of social status. But another part, a part that had been buried under years of acceptance and moving on, wanted Addison to see exactly what she'd lost when she'd chosen to erase her family from her carefully constructed new life. We should go, Ethan said, and his voice carried the kind of quiet determination she'd learned to recognize as dangerous to anyone who opposed him. Not to celebrate her wedding, but to show her who you've become. The idea terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Walking into that ballroom, on Ethan's arm would announce to Atlanta's social elite that the sister Addison had spent years denying was not just alive, but thriving beyond anything Addison had achieved. But it would also mean facing the pain of seeing her twin, the person who'd once been her other half, surrounded by everything she'd chosen over family loyalty. It would mean walking into a room full of people who would judge every detail of her appearance and background, looking for signs that she didn't belong among them. I don't want to ruin her wedding, Lila said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure they were entirely true. You won't ruin anything, Ethan replied, moving closer and taking her hands. You'll just exist in the same space as her. If that ruins something, that's about her choices, not yours. The weeks of preparation that followed felt like training for a battle she'd never wanted to fight but couldn't avoid. Ethan approached it with the same methodical planning he brought to business acquisitions, ensuring every detail would send the right message. The dress they selected cost more than many people's annual salaries. Midnight blue silk that showcased her figure without being inappropriate, elegant enough for any venue, but striking enough to command attention. Jewelry that sparkled with the kind of quiet wealth that spoke volumes to people who understood such things. But the real preparation was emotional. Night after night, they talked through her feelings about seeing Addison again, about walking into a world where she'd always been unwelcome, about the possibility that her sister might try to publicly humiliate her in front of all those witnesses. She spent years building a life based on pretending you don't exist. Ethan reminded her during one late-night conversation. But you do exist. You not just survived everything she abandoned you to face, you've thrived. That's not revenge. That's truth. The night before they left for Atlanta, Ethan pulled out a small velvet box. "I'm not proposing," he said quickly, seeing her expression. "But I want her to see this on your finger and know exactly how much you're worth." Inside was a ring that cost more than most people's houses. Walking back into Atlanta, wearing diamonds and designer silk, felt like putting on armor for a battle she'd been preparing for her entire life. The Ritz-Carlton Atlanta rose like a monument to Southern elegance, its lobby filled with magnolia scents and money, the perfect stage for a reckoning years in the making. The flight from New York to Atlanta felt like traveling through time as well as space. Lila pressed her face to the airplane window during descent, watching the city sprawl below her in patterns she remembered from childhood dreams of escape. Now she was returning not as the girl who'd left with nothing but grief and determination, but as a woman who commanded attention in any room she entered. Ethan squeezed her hand as they waited to disembark, sensing the tension that had been building since they'd left his penthouse that morning. "Second thoughts?" he asked quietly. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. But no going back. The Ritz-Carlton Atlanta embodied everything she'd once thought was impossibly out of reach. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, staff who moved with the kind of smooth efficiency that made expensive hospitality look effortless. But instead of feeling intimidated by the luxury, she found herself noticing details with the eye of someone who'd worked in similar venues. The way servers anticipated needs, the subtle security measures, the careful choreography that kept wealthy guests comfortable. Their suite overlooked Peachtree Street, floor-to-ceiling windows framing a city that had grown and changed since her last visit, but still carried the humid weight of southern summers and social hierarchies that stretched back generations. Being here with Ethan felt like bringing a secret weapon to a fight she'd been losing her entire life. The pre-wedding events started immediately. Atlanta society operated on a circuit of lunches, cocktail parties, and charity functions that allowed the same people to see and be seen by each other in slightly different configurations. Addison's wedding week was packed with opportunities for guests to celebrate the happy couple while networking and social positioning disguised as festivity. Have you ever had to face someone who hurt you after becoming stronger? How did it feel to return to a place that held painful memories? Their first public appearance was at the rehearsal dinner welcome cocktail party, held in the hotel's ballroom with guest lists that read like Atlanta's social registry. Lila had spent hours getting ready, not out of vanity, but because she understood that every detail of her appearance would be analyzed and discussed by people who specialized in finding flaws in others. The dress they'd selected was perfect, sophisticated enough to command respect, beautiful enough to turn heads, expensive enough to communicate her new status without appearing to try too hard. The jewelry Ethan had insisted she wore made statements that anyone familiar with high-end accessories would recognize immediately. But the real transformation was internal. As they walked through the hotel corridors toward the party, Lila realized she wasn't the same person who'd once served drinks to people like the ones they were about to meet. She developed confidence that came from being valued, intelligence sharpened by education and opportunity, presence that had been cultivated through months of moving in circles where her opinion mattered. When they entered the ballroom, conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. Eyes tracked their movement across marble floors, noting details and making calculations about who they were and why they mattered. Ethan's presence alone would have guaranteed attention, but Lila's poise and obvious comfort in his company sparked the kind of curiosity that fueled social media posts and gossip column speculation. Ethan Marshall. David Whitmore appeared within minutes, his relief at seeing a business contact palpable. "Thank you so much for coming. And this must be..." His voice trailed off as he looked at Lila, clearly expecting an introduction. "This is Lila," Ethan said smoothly, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that claimed and protected simultaneously. "My partner." The word carried multiple meanings that David absorbed with the kind of rapid social calculation that marked him as someone accustomed to reading relationships for business advantage. Partner could mean business associate, romantic involvement, or something more serious. And David's expression showed him cycling through possibilities while maintaining his welcoming smile. Lila extended her hand with confidence she'd learned through months of similar introductions. "Congratulations on your wedding," she said warmly. Addison must be so excited. Something flickered across David's face as he shook her hand. A moment of confusion or recognition that disappeared so quickly she might have imagined it. But she caught it and filed it away for later consideration. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and conversations that felt like elaborate social theater. Lila found herself enjoying the performance aspects of moving through Atlanta society, using skills she developed in New York to navigate conversations about topics that had once seemed impossibly sophisticated. But the real test would come the next day, at the wedding itself, when she'd face Addison directly for the first time in over a decade. That night, in their suite's bedroom, the city lights of Atlanta spreading below them, Ethan pulled her close as they prepared for sleep. "You were magnificent tonight," he whispered against her hair. Every person in that room could see exactly what your sister threw away. As they dressed for the wedding, Lila's hands shook putting on her earrings. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she whispered. Ethan turned her to face the mirror, his arms around her waist. "Look at yourself. Really look. You're not the girl who got left behind anymore." The moment she walked through those ballroom doors, 20 years of shame evaporated and 20 seconds of shock took its place. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. The bride, frozen at the altar in her white silk gown, watched her worst nightmare unfold in slow motion. Because there, walking down the center aisle like she owned the entire building, was the sister she'd spent years pretending didn't exist. But this wasn't the broken girl Addison remembered. This was a woman who moved like royalty, whose diamond earrings caught the chandelier light with every step, whose designer dress probably cost more than most people's cars. And on her arm, Ethan Marshall, the man whose net worth could buy and sell half the people in this room before breakfast. The wedding photographer kept snapping pictures, but every lens was pointed at the entrance now. The bride had become yesterday's news in her own ceremony. Addison's hands shook as she gripped her bouquet. Her groom, sensing something wrong, followed her gaze and his face went white. He recognized Ethan from business magazines, from Forbes covers, from late-night anxiety dreams about men who could destroy careers with a phone call. "Who is that?" he whispered to his bride. Addison couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, because the woman walking toward them with such confidence, such grace, such obvious wealth draped around her shoulders like a crown, that was supposed to be the failure, the one who stayed behind, the one who didn't matter. The minister kept talking, but his words faded into background noise. The entire ballroom was watching Lila and Ethan take their seats in the back row, watching how he held out her chair, how his hand lingered on her shoulder, how she smiled up at him with the kind of intimacy that money couldn't buy. Mrs. Henderson from the country club leaned over to her husband. "Do you know who that is with Marshall?" "She's stunning. Never seen her before," he replied, adjusting his glasses. "But if she's with him, she's somebody important. Somebody important." The words hit Addison like a slap across the face. Because the woman they were whispering about, the woman commanding attention in her own wedding ceremony, was the same person she told everyone didn't exist. The ceremony continued, but it felt like watching a play through frosted glass. Everything was distorted now. The vows her groom was saying sounded hollow. The promises he was making felt empty, because standing in the back of the room was proof that she'd built her entire life on lies. When a minister finally pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss felt like a performance for an audience that wasn't even watching. Everyone was still stealing glances at the couple in the back row, still trying to figure out how they'd never heard of the woman who clearly belonged in their world. As guests began filing out for the reception, Addison caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach twist. "She has excellent taste in jewelry. That dress is definitely couture. Marshall doesn't bring just anyone to events like this. I wonder if she's from New York society." New York society. They thought Lila was from New York society. The same woman who used to serve food at events like this was now being mistaken for old money royalty. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't destroying everything Addison had worked to build. At the reception, she tried to play the gracious bride, but her smile felt painted on. Every time she looked across the garden, there was Lila, surrounded by Atlanta's elite, talking and laughing like she'd been born to this world. And there was Ethan, never more than a step away, looking at her sister like she was the most fascinating woman on earth. The reversal was complete. The forgotten twin had arrived as the guest of honor, while the golden child felt invisible at her own wedding. Her new husband approached, loosening his bow tie. "Honey, do you know why Ethan Marshall is here?" "My business partners are asking questions I can't answer." "I have no idea," she lied, the words tasting bitter. But across the garden, under the Spanish moss and twinkling lights, Lila was about to make sure everyone knew exactly why she was there. The real wedding drama didn't happen at the altar. It happened when two sisters finally faced each other after a decade of silence. The garden reception sparkled with southern charm, white roses and Spanish moss creating a fairy tale backdrop for a reckoning that was anything but romantic. Crystal glasses clinked, laughter echoed across the manicured lawns, and somewhere in the distance, a string quartet played music that seemed to mock the tension building like a summer storm. Lila stood near the fountain, Ethan beside her, watching her sister work the crowd with desperate efficiency. Addison moved from group to group like a politician on election night, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. She was performing damage control for a crisis only she understood. "She's afraid," Ethan observed quietly, his hand warm on Lila's lower back. "She should be." Lila's voice was steady, but her heart was racing. Being here, in this world that had rejected her, wearing clothes that cost more than she used to make in a year, felt like stepping through a looking glass into an impossible dream. Mrs. Patterson from the garden club approached them, champagne flute in hand. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I am Kittin Patterson. You must be visiting from New York." "Lila," she replied, extending her hand with newfound confidence. "And yes, I've been living up north." "What a lovely accent you have. Very refined. And your dress is absolutely divine." "Is that Valentino?" "It is." Lila felt Ethan's proud smile without looking at him. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have known Valentino from Target. Now she wore it like armor. "How do you know our bride?" Mrs. Patterson's question hung in the air like humidity. Before Lila could answer, Addison appeared at her elbow, her face a mask of forced pleasantness. "Mrs. Patterson, I see you've met my old friend from childhood." Lila was just passing through town. "Old friend." The casual dismissal hit exactly as intended, but bounced off the new Lila like rain off marble. "Actually," Lila said, her voice carrying clearly across their small circle, "Addison and I grew up together. We're quite close." The emphasis on close was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Patterson's eyes lit up with curiosity. "How wonderful. Childhood friends are so precious. You must have such stories to share." "Oh, we do," Lila agreed, meeting her sister's panicked gaze. "We practically lived in each other's pockets growing up. Shared everything. Secrets, dreams, responsibilities." Addison's champagne glass trembled in her hand. Lila's always been dramatic in her storytelling. "I prefer honest," Lila corrected gently. "I was just telling Ethan earlier about how we took care of our mother together during her illness." "Well, I say together." She let the sentence hang, watching her sister's composure crack. Mrs. Patterson's face softened with sympathy. "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. It must have been difficult for both of you girls." "It was especially hard doing it alone," Lila said quietly. "But some people handle grief differently. Some people run toward family, others run away from it." The color drained from Addison's face. Around them, other conversations continued, but their little circle had become charged with unspoken tension. Mrs. Patterson looked confused, sensing undercurrents she couldn't identify. Ethan stepped closer to Lila, his presence a wall of support. "Lila has the strongest character of anyone I've ever met. The way she handled her family responsibilities while her friends pursued their own interests was remarkable." "That's not." Addison started, then stopped. Because how could she deny it without admitting the truth about who Lila really was? How could she defend abandoning their mother without revealing she'd been lying about her family for years? "Not what?" Lila asked innocently. Not accurate, because I have hospital records, funeral programs, medical bills I paid alone while you were here, playing society wife. Should I share those details with Mrs. Patterson? The threat was velvet-covered steel. Addison's carefully constructed world was balanced on a knife's edge, and they both knew it. Ladies, Mrs. Patterson said uncomfortably, perhaps this isn't the time or place. You're absolutely right, Lila agreed smoothly. Some conversations are better had in private. She looked directly at her sister. After all, family business should stay in the family. The word family hit Addison like a physical blow, because she'd spent years telling everyone she was an only child, and now the sister she'd erased was standing in her wedding reception, wearing more diamonds than the bride, on the arm of a man who could destroy her husband's career with a single phone call. As Mrs. Patterson excused herself, clearly sensing the tension, Addison finally found her voice. "What do you want?" she hissed, all pretense of friendliness gone. "Money? Because whatever he's paying you, it won't last." Lila smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. "Oh, Addison, you still don't understand anything at all. Some truths are whispered in private. Others are announced with the force of a hurricane in front of George's entire social elite." Lila's response to her sister's accusation would echo through Atlanta society for years to come, but not for the reasons anyone expected. Instead of anger or vengeance, her voice carried something far more powerful, quiet dignity that cut through lies like sunlight through fog. "What I want," Lila said clearly, her voice carrying across the garden reception, "is for you to remember that family isn't something you can just erase when it becomes inconvenient." The conversations around them began to quiet. Other guests sensed drama unfolding and drifted closer, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. The string quartet played on, but their classical music felt increasingly out of place as modern tragedy took center stage. Addison glanced around nervously, realizing their private confrontation was becoming public theater. "Lila, please. This isn't the place. Isn't it?" Lila's eyebrows rose. "Because this seems like exactly the place to talk about family, considering we're celebrating your marriage. Tell me, did you mention me in your wedding vows? Or did you stick with the story about being an only child?" A gasp rippled through the nearby guests. Mrs. Henderson stepped closer, her social radar detecting scandal like a bloodhound catching a scent. "Only child." Mrs. Patterson looked confused. "But didn't you just say you grew up together?" Addison's face cycled through emotions: panic, anger, desperation. Lila's confused. The stress of our mother's death affected her. "Our mother?" Lila's voice sharpened. "Interesting choice of words, considering you told the hospital you had no family when they called looking for next of kin. Considering you changed your phone number so she couldn't reach you during treatment. Considering you missed her funeral because you were at a spa weekend in Charleston." The garden reception had gone completely silent now, except for the quartet, whose cheerful Mozart suddenly sounded like a funeral march. Every guest within earshot was listening, their faces showing mixtures of shock, confusion, and growing understanding. Ethan moved closer to Lila, his hand finding hers. His touch was steady, grounding, reminding her that she wasn't alone this time. "That's not. I couldn't," Addison stammered, but the damage was spreading like spilled wine on white silk. "You couldn't what?" Lila pressed gently. "Couldn't be bothered? Couldn't risk your reputation? Couldn't be seen in a charity ward hospital visiting the mother you told everyone died years ago?" "Ladies," Addison's new husband approached, his face pale with growing panic. He'd been watching from across the garden as his wife's careful facade crumbled in real time. "Perhaps we should take this inside." "No." Lila's voice was firm, but not cruel. "I spent years hiding in the shadows while she pretended I didn't exist. I won't hide anymore." She looked around the circle of shocked faces, Atlanta's social elite realizing they'd been lied to for years by one of their own. "My name is Lila. I'm Addison's twin sister. We grew up poor in Birmingham, Alabama, in a trailer park that she's probably never mentioned. I worked 3 jobs to help pay for her college, took care of our sick mother alone while she built her social career, and buried our parent by myself because my sister was too ashamed of where she came from to say goodbye. The silence was deafening. Cell phones appeared discreetly as guests realized they were witnessing Atlanta's social scandal of the decade. But here's what she never understood, Lila continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You can't erase family. You can't pretend away the people who loved you, who sacrificed for you, who believed in you when no one else did. And you can't build a real life on lies. Mrs. Henderson found her voice first. Addison, is this true? Do you have a twin sister? Addison looked trapped, cornered, like an animal caught in headlights. It's complicated. It's really not, Lila said sadly. It's actually quite simple. She was ashamed of her family, so she erased us. The only complicated part is how she lived with herself. That's enough. Ethan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Not angry, not threatening, just absolute authority that made everyone listen. My fiancé has said what needed to be said. Fiancé. The word rippled through the crowd like electricity. Addison stared at the diamond on Lila's finger, a ring she hadn't noticed before, couldn't have imagined, wouldn't have believed possible. The engagement ring wasn't the biggest shock of the evening, Lila said quietly, looking directly at her sister. It was realizing that the woman I used to look up to, used to sacrifice everything for, never existed at all. You created a character to play in this world, but you forgot that characters aren't real people. Real people don't abandon their family when they need them most. As the crowd absorbed this revelation, Ethan stepped forward with an announcement that no one saw coming. There's something else you should all know about the woman you've underestimated your entire lives. The engagement ring wasn't the biggest shock of the evening. It was what Lila had accomplished on her own before she ever met him. Ethan's voice carried across the garden with the kind of authority that made boardrooms silent and stock prices move. The woman you're looking at didn't just survive being abandoned by her family. She thrived. The crowd pressed closer, phones recording, society matrons hanging on every word. This wasn't just scandal anymore. This was the complete rewriting of someone they thought they knew. Lila didn't tell you that while she was caring for your mother, he looked directly at Addison. She was also completing her business degree online. Didn't mention that she started a consulting firm that helps small businesses navigate healthcare bureaucracy. Didn't share that her company has saved over 200 families from medical bankruptcy. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. This wasn't the story they'd expected. This wasn't a poor relation seeking handouts. She also didn't tell you, Ethan continued, his pride unmistakable, that she's been anonymously funding scholarships for students from low-income families, or that she's consulted on 3 of my foundation's major initiatives, or that she turned down my first job offer because she said she wanted to earn her place, not be given it. Mrs. Patterson's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the brick pathway. You mean she was already successful when you met? More than successful, Ethan replied. She was remarkable. Still is. The only difference now is that she's finally in an environment that recognizes her worth. Addison stood frozen, watching her carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Because the narrative she'd built, successful sister, failure twin, was crumbling like sand castles in a rising tide. I don't understand, Mrs. Henderson said, looking between the sisters. If Lila was doing so well, why didn't we know about her? Why hasn't she been part of our social circle? Because, Lila said quietly, I was never invited. Addison made sure of that. Every time I tried to reconnect, I hit walls. Phone numbers changed. Invitations never came. I was erased so completely that I started to believe I deserved to be invisible. Until you met Ethan, someone called out. Lila shook her head. No, until I met Ethan, I thought my worth was tied to other people's recognition. He didn't make me valuable. He helped me see the value I already had. The crowd was completely silent now, absorbed in this real-time revelation of deception and redemption. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folder. Since we're sharing truths tonight, here's another one. Addison's husband's construction company has been bidding on several of my development projects. Given what I've learned about his family values, I'll be taking my business elsewhere." The blood drained from both Addison and her husband's faces. Those contracts represented millions in revenue, the foundation of their financial future. "You can't do this," Addison's husband stammered. "This is business, not personal." "Everything is personal," Ethan replied calmly. "The way you treat family, the way you handle loyalty, the way you conduct yourself when no one's watching, that tells me everything I need to know about your business ethics." "This is revenge," Addison said desperately. "This is just revenge because she's jealous." "This is consequences," Lila corrected gently. "This is what happens when you spend years burning bridges and then realize you need them to get home." The garden erupted in whispered conversations as the full scope of the evening's revelations sank in. The forgotten twin wasn't just back. She was wealthy, successful, engaged to the most powerful man in the room, and apparently capable of destroying careers with a conversation. But as guests began approaching Lila with new interest, new respect, new invitations, she felt something she hadn't expected: sadness. Because watching her sister's world collapse should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like another kind of loss. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan announced, his arm around Lila's waist, "we should be going. We have our own celebration to plan." As they began to leave, Addison caught Lila's arm desperately. "Wait, please. I can't. This will ruin everything. My reputation, my husband's business, our whole life." Lila looked at her sister, really looked at her, for the first time in years. Saw past the designer dress and perfect makeup to the fear underneath. Saw the girl who used to share secrets and dreams before ambition poisoned everything between them. "Your whole life was built on ruining mine," she said quietly. "But unlike you, I don't want to destroy family. I want to heal it." "What does that mean?" "It means this ends here. Tonight." The lies, the pretending, the erasure. "You acknowledge that I exist, that our mother existed, that our family mattered. You stop pretending to be an only child. And maybe, someday, we figure out how to be sisters again." Addison's eyes filled with tears, the first real emotion she'd shown all evening. "And if I do that, if I admit everything, then maybe forgiveness becomes possible," Lila said. "But it has to be your choice. I'm done begging for scraps of recognition from my own family." As they prepared to leave the reception, Addison made one last desperate attempt to salvage her reputation. Her final words to Lila would either destroy what remained of their relationship forever or finally open the door to something like forgiveness. A year later, the same ballroom that witnessed Addison's humiliation hosted Lila's triumph. But this time, forgiveness wore a wedding dress. The Ritz-Carlton Atlanta sparkled with the same crystal chandeliers, the same golden light dancing across marble floors, the same southern elegance that had provided the backdrop for scandal 12 months earlier. But everything had changed. The forgotten sister now stood at the altar as the bride, surrounded by love instead of spite, building instead of destroying. Lila's wedding dress was simpler than Addison's had been. Classic lines that spoke of confidence rather than compensation, elegance that didn't need to shout to be heard. The guest list was different too. Alongside Atlanta's society were faces from her old life. Former co-workers, clients whose businesses she'd saved, scholarship recipients whose lives she'd changed. But the most significant difference was in the third row on the bride's side, where Addison sat with her husband, both of them humble but present. Because in the years since that explosive wedding reception, something unexpected had happened. Healing. It hadn't been immediate. The night of the confrontation, Addison had lost everything she'd built her identity around. Social invitations dried up. Business deals evaporated. The perfect life she'd constructed from lies crumbled like sand. But Lila had meant what she said about consequences versus revenge. Instead of pressing her advantage, she'd offered something more powerful: truth and the possibility of redemption. The first step had been Addison's public admission. A carefully worded statement acknowledging her sister, their humble beginnings, and her regret over years of separation. It wasn't complete honesty, but it was a beginning. The second step had been therapy, individual sessions for Addison to understand her shame, and fear, joint sessions for both sisters to rebuild trust. It was messy, painful work with no guarantees. The third step had been action. When Addison's husband's business struggled after losing Ethan's contracts, Lila had offered consulting services. Not charity, but professional help rebuilding with integrity. It was a bridge toward respect, if not yet love. Now, as the wedding ceremony began, Lila looked out at faces that represented every chapter of her story. Her past wasn't hidden anymore. It was integrated, acknowledged, transformed into something that strengthened rather than shamed her. The minister's voice carried clearly across the ballroom. Marriage is about choosing to see and accept all parts of each other. The history, the dreams, the fears, the hopes. It's about building something new while honoring what came before. As Ethan took her hands, Lila felt the weight of the journey that had brought them here. Not just the Cinderella story everyone saw on the surface, but the deeper transformation from invisible to valued, from ashamed to proud, from abandoned to chosen. "You're not the woman I met at that charity gala," he said during his vows, his voice steady and sure. "You're stronger, more confident, more yourself than ever. But you're also exactly who you've always been inside, generous, loyal, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with money or status. I love both versions of you, and I can't wait to see who you become next." When it was her turn, Lila looked out at the crowd before speaking. "A year ago, I thought my worth was measured by who acknowledged me. I spent years trying to earn recognition from people who had already decided I didn't matter. But I learned something important. Your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it." Her eyes found Addison, who was wiping away tears. Not the performance tears of her own wedding, but genuine emotion. "I also learned that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing not to let it define your future. Some people will always disappoint you. Some relationships will never be what you hoped. But that doesn't mean you stop hoping, stop loving, stop being generous with your heart." After the ceremony, the reception felt different from the disaster a year earlier. Laughter was genuine, conversations were real, and the undercurrent of scandal had been replaced by celebration. During the sister dance, a tradition Lila had suggested as another step toward healing, Addison spoke quietly in her ear. "I don't know how to be a sister anymore," she admitted. "I don't know how to stop being jealous, stop competing, stop seeing your success as my failure." "We'll figure out together," Lila replied. "But it has to be something you want, not something you're doing because it's socially expected." "I want it," Addison said, and for the first time in decades, it sounded true. "I want to remember what it was like before I became so afraid of not being enough that I forgot we used to be everything to each other." As the evening wound down, Lila and Ethan stood on the hotel balcony overlooking Atlanta's skyline. The city stretched out below them, lights twinkling like stars, full of possibilities they were only beginning to explore. "Any regrets?" Ethan asked, pulling her close. "About the wedding? Never. About coming back to Atlanta last year? Not even for a second." She paused, thinking. "Maybe one small regret." "What's that?" "I wish our mother could have been here to see this. To see that both her daughters found their way home eventually, even if we took very different paths to get there. She would have been proud," Ethan said certainly. "Not of the dress, or the venue, or the guest list. She would have been proud that you chose love over revenge, healing over hatred." As they looked out over the city where it all began, Lila realized her story wasn't really about rising above her circumstances or proving her worth to people who had dismissed her. It wasn't even about finding love with a billionaire or gaining access to a world that had rejected her. It was about something simpler and more profound. Learning that your worth isn't determined by who believes in you. It's determined by what you choose to believe about yourself. And what Lila had finally chosen to believe was this. She was enough. She had always been enough. The girl who stayed behind to care for their mother, who worked multiple jobs to pay for someone else's dreams, who built a business while grieving alone. That girl had never been the failure in the story. She had been the hero all along.